Hello, so this is part two of the lecture. So we just discussed crypt time, and I'll move on to discuss the relationship between epistemic violence, decolonization, and disability studies. So epistemic violence is a concept from Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who's a post-colonial scholar. And Spivak is interested in the ways that epistemology, the study of knowledge, often centers the languages and life worlds and writings of Europeans and European colonizers. So what the authors for this week's reading discuss is the relationship between the production of knowledge, disability, and colonialism. They ask these questions. How might indigenous peoples' critiques of liberal humanist ontology and conceptions of interdependency and mind-body space inform disability studies scholarship, particularly in grappling with settler coloniality? What insights might indigenous epistemologies offer regarding the tension between valuing disability, example as a social identity and meaningful epistemic location, and rejecting interwoven systems of power? Example, settler colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy that produce mass disablement. And how can the reification of settler coloniality through the dearth of indigenous theory recognized within the field be rejecting without at the same time co-opting or appropriating indigenous knowledges or claiming easy, comfortable coalition or commonality? The disablement of land body as a tactic of settler colonialism has persisted for centuries and takes various forms. By highlighting indigenous struggles to protect Mother Earth and her sacred resources, we suggest that indigenous ontology, specifically relationships to land, challenges disability theory at the epistemological level by rejecting the taken for granted dualism between the environment space and disabled human bodies with settler disability studies. So the authors focus on three areas of potential convergence or likeness between disability and indigenous theories. Firstly, a logic of elimination or erasure driven by capitalism's need for continuous expansion and extraction of value is central to both disability, oppression, and settler colonialism. Secondly, the mobilization of sovereignty as a framework or rallying call for pursuing self-determination and justice. And three, theorizations of futurity and an insistence on imagining alternative futures which are born from the past and shape the present. So, Canada's disability studies scholarship has largely neglected to address the disabling effects of settler colonialism on Indigenous peoples and lands. Aiming to contribute to the ongoing development of decolonial disability theory, we offer 3 points of theoretical and practical convergence through which to consider a recent and widely known manifestation of Native resistance to settler colonialism. Standing Rock resistance against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which we read as a struggle for disability justice. So, what is interesting about the author's argument is they look at the ways that even within theories of disability, settler colonialism has often shaped the societies and the institutions in which disability studies is produced. Neither settler colonial disablement nor indigenous resistance to settler coloniality are new or unique to this historical moment. The denial of indigenous sovereignty and disablement of native people land for the sake of capitalist profit accumulation is foundational to the structure of the U.S. state. The history of uranium mining on the sovereign territory of indigenous peoples, which has resulted in native peoples in the northern Great Plains having the highest cancer rates in the U.S., attests to the long history of settler colonial land body displacement. Indigenous scholars' initial interventions focus on worldview, Vine Aloria Jr., a foundational scholar, writes that the major difference between American Indian views of the physical world and Western science lies in the premise accepted by Indians and rejected by scientists: the world in which we live is alive. Linda T. Smith echoes this sentiment with a text devoted to untangling colonial narratives and asserting that Indigenous and Western epistemologies are different in worldview, knowledge systems, values, and norms. Although there are countless indigenous nations with differing worldviews, practices, and cultures, indigenous peoples find solidarity by naming several points at which they resist Western ontologies. Some of these agreed upon distinctions include a connection to land, mentally, physically, and spiritually, shared political agendas which advocate for sovereignty and recognition as independent nations, and their recognition of First Peoples on lands prior to colonization and settler contact. So, disability studies challenges a Western medical approach to disability, which frames disability as a deficiency located in individual bodies that should be fixed through medical intervention. A narrow medical model shapes dominant conceptions of disability in the US and other global northern settler states and depoliticizes disability by obscuring disabled people's shared experiences of oppression under a system of able-bodied supremacy. The social model of disability alternatively locates the problem not in individual bodies, but in a society that renders particular bodies disabled. Social and political approaches highlight how disability is not inevitably fixed to certain embodiments, but is instead socially constituted within geographical and historical contexts. Disability activists and scholars are right to condemn references to disability as solely a tragic symbol or consequence of oppression and exploitation. Yet the tendency of disability studies scholars in settler colonial states to uphold disability as the largest and most universal group of oppressed people in the world, while failing to condemn colonial and imperial practices that disable millions in oppressed and occupied nations, fundamentally undermines the liberation of all oppressed and exploited peoples of the world. So, the authors discuss the ways that there is often a silence around bodily difference. While bodily difference often is a way in which people are routinely oppressed, in everyday ways like casual forms of discrimination or exclusion, and also hate crimes. So silence around the material and corporeal realities of racialized settler colonial capitalism leaves these systems in place and futilely attempts to build a liberatory disability movement on the oppression of others. So Sarah Ahmed discusses the ways that whiteness gains its currency by going unnoticed. And Ahmed asks, what would it mean to notice whiteness? What would it mean to also notice ability and the ways that normative ideas of the body, citizenship, race, and identity structure oppression, exclusion, and violations of the law? Legislation such as the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that is confined to this Eurocentric framework, offers no recourse for the production of disability consequent of imperialism, colonialism, and material conditions of globalized capitalism. Disability justice, a framework developed by queer disabled women of color, transcends a narrowly individualized disability rights model and emphasizes that disability liberation is tied to the liberation of all peoples, necessitating anti-capitalist movements led by those at the furthest margins of society. So, as I mentioned, epistemic violence is really about knowledge production and who feels that they are in a position to produce knowledge against the truth claims of others. So, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's foundational essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, looks at the way that knowledge production is connected to both colonialism and patriarchy.
Like restaurant owners trust insurance for fast, affordable coverage 100% online. Be protected. Be Zen. If you got 1 to 4 correct, you're a chaotic thinker. If you got 5 to 8 correct,
Alrighty, so back again. This time we're talking about Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? A pretty important text in like every field, but pretty specifically in post-colonial studies and feminist thought. So, a few things to say before jumping into this. Um, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy. You can also find this in podcast form unless you already are. But anyways, if you aren't, if you're on YouTube, you can find this pretty much anywhere you get podcasts and there are no ads there, thank God, because ads are deplorable. You can also support me on Instagram, on Patreon or PayPal if you would like. But in these times, be sure to contribute to those that need it most, like Black content creators or Black Lives Matter, or any organization that's currently helping Black trans people, for instance. Anything like that. If you think about giving me anything, consider first giving to them. Uh, and on that note, I'd like to thank a number of people: Anshul, Paul, Amrit, Honrick, Used, Killswitch, Julio, John, Boz, Matt, and James, and Ashley, who've all been super helpful in keeping this going. And then without further ado, let's jump into this because this is a really difficult text, and I want to say that I'm gonna do my best to present what's going on here. But there's a lot, and it's really dense for short text. It's extremely dense, and there are things I'm not going to be going into. So if, and I normally say this at the end, but if I mischaracterize Spivak in any way, or there are things I omitted that I should have included, I'd really love it if you could include it. But I'm going to try my best to make this text make sense. So let's start then from just the title. She's asking, can the subaltern speak? So most of those words make sense. We know what they mean. Subaltern, on the other hand, is a little bit of a tricky word. So if we break it down, it is comprised of two words, the prefix sub and I guess the root or the main word, altern. So sub means less than. It is below altern. That's a guitar pick that fell. Altern. So if we think of altern, it might connote a few different things. To be altern might be to be alternate. It might mean to be different. It might mean to be maybe less developed. Uh, in any case, it means quite roughly, we can understand it to mean different. Now, when she's saying she puts these two words together, that is sub and altern, or the prefix with altern, she's saying that people who are sub almost different, right? These are people that are less than just different, because difference works within a kind of dialectic. It works within a field of intelligibility, to use a kind of fancy way to describe it, where these people aren't even recognized. Now, she's describing this in the case of colonized people, specifically colonized women, but men, of course, fall into this category as well, where colonized people having their entire cultures stripped away, uh, and there is established, colonial rule, colonial legal apparatuses, various other colonial institutions. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for colonized people to have a voice. So I'm just saying that to kind of set the tone here. And spoiler alert, for her, the subaltern cannot speak. That is how she ends the piece. So I think it's important to lay that out because it'll give us an understanding of what she's doing through the rest of the text. Now, as for the beginning, she sets out by positioning herself against the work of Deleuze and Foucault. So these are two French thinkers, Gilles Deleuze or Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault, two French thinkers, writing prominently in the 70s. and early 80s and through the 80s with Deleuze, who Spivak wants to challenge. And there are a few different reasons for this, and we're going to get into them. But just to say kind of broadly, she associates them with the broader project of post-structuralism. Now, it would be wrong of us to say that Spivak is writing against post-structuralism. Totally. She's not. She is writing against Deleuze and Foucault. And the reason I say that is because she takes solace or finds solace in the work of Jacques Derrida, whose work she's going to make reference to toward the end of this piece. Now, don't worry about it yet if you don't know what these thinkers say respectively, because we're going to get into that. But I'm just trying to set the tone here, or the contrast that she develops between herself and these thinkers. So what these thinkers were doing, that is Deleuze and Foucault, this is how Spivak characterizes them. So they are responding to the idea of the Western subject. So what is that? Well, it comes out of the Enlightenment, specifically in modernity, where there was, and there were a number of figures that were responsible for this. Some of them were Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, to go back a little bit further, I guess, who were positing that the human, which is often a white, European human, has inalienable rights as a subject. They have various needs as far as their legal representation should go, as far as their livelihood should be, and so on and so forth. And what this did, especially in the case of John Locke, was kind of justify the white European man's position on the world stage. That is, a position that was greater than everyone else's. So, with that, they were able to justify things like colonialism and imperialism and just taking from other people, essentially. Now, this is obviously very problematic. And this is something that Deleuze and Foucault both take on in their own way. Now, I'm going to be very brief about how they're different, but because I want to highlight how they are the same. But for Deleuze, and his work is wrapped up with another guy named Felix Guattari, who they wrote together, the two of them. And what they were arguing is that this idea of a kind of unitary total subject is erroneous when we consider the ways that humans change and develop. And this comes about simply by humans existing alongside other humans, alongside animals, alongside.
So I'm writing an essay on cats in art history. I'm an art history major, and
inanimate objects too. There's always a kind of change and flux emerging. So they use this idea to oppose the idea of the kind of Enlightenment subject, this kind of total, anthropocentric subject that places the human, more specifically the white European male human, above everyone else. So I want to read just a little quote from them that Spivak doesn't supply, but I will here just to give you an idea about what Deleuze and Guattari are doing.
So this critique of the Enlightenment subject is also central to disability studies. The idea of the kind of omnipotent narrator who stands outside of history, and also of the disembodied rational person whose mind is above their body, is something that is challenged in both post-colonial theory and theories of disability. So Gayatri Spivak writes that although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. Much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. So it is only when this subject pretends to be outside of history and has this objective gaze onto the rest of the world that subjectivity is formed as a European in relation to others. So Spivak discusses the ways that colonialism was often presented as a story of white men and sometimes white women saving brown women from brown men. And this kind of speaking on behalf of others was central to colonial history and colonial discourse. So, knowledge production about others, about colonized subjects, often involved this colonial gaze. And this is true of white settler knowledge production in the Americas as well. The indigenous people were and are often spoken about and on behalf of. And what disability studies scholars and post-colonial scholars share is this kind of centering of positionality. And it's something we've discussed in previous lectures when we talked about standpoint epistemology. And Sandra Harding is a feminist standpoint epistemologist, and Patricia Hill Collins writes about Black feminist standpoint epistemology. So, standpoint epistemology is a school of thought, or it's a theoretical set of ideas that would challenge the idea of positivism. When we speak from a certain social location. So, when we presume that we know how others feel, or that we can produce knowledge about and for others, we are actually imposing our own positionality onto others. We are stealing someone's voice. And this kind of stealing of someone's position, narrating their history, is also central to economic theft. So colonialism involves not only theft of land, theft of property, enslavement of others, and involves speaking on behalf of others. In the face of the possibility that the intellectual is complicit in the persistent constitution of other as the self's shadow, a possibility of political practice for the intellectual will be to put the economic under erasure, to see the economic factor as irreducible, as it reinscribes the social text, even as it is erased, however imperfectly, when it claims to be the final determinant or the transcendental signified. So this kind of economic factor, which is often concealed, is really central to knowledge production, that those who can produce knowledge, who can speak on behalf of others, can also profit financially from others. And this is central to colonial discourse, and it's also central to the ways that the history of eugenic ideology, the history of ableism has often allowed the medical establishment, NGOs, those who purport to care about others, to speak on behalf of people with disabilities and to profit financially from this kind of appropriation. So the clearest available example of epistemic violence is the remotely orchestrated, far-flung, and heterogeneous project to constitute the colonial subject as other. This project is also the asymmetrical obliteration of the trace of that other in its precarious subjectivity. It is well known that Foucault locates epistemic violence, a complete overhaul of the episteme, in the redefinition of sanity at the end of European 18th century. So as a queer male scholar, Foucault was interested in the ways that rationality and sanity often produce the queer subject as being one who was supposedly diseased or in need of medical care. And this kind of extreme form of homophobia and medical homophobia was used to justify the persecution of queer people, medicalization of queer people, and also was used by the medical establishment to profit financially from the construction of feminists and queer people as those in need of supposed medical treatment. So medical discrimination, medical racism, medical persecution of minorities often involves constructing bodily difference, constructing behavioral difference, even constructing political differences as being medical problems that one has to, that the state or that medical racist will um, administer solutions for. And there's often a cost to those solutions. The feminist movement has long documented the ways in which women who resist domestic violence, rape, sexual abuse are often deemed to be problematic or even to have mental health issues that they are then kind of persecuted for, or they have to pay money to solve. And in reality, what the feminist movement has documented are the ways in which political differences in opinion, a refusal to conform, a refusal to be abused is not a medical problem. It is a difference in political opinion. So finally, I'll finish by discussing extermination and eugenics. So I began the first part of the lecture by talking about eugenics and the way in which eugenic policy often tried to sterilize those who were deemed to be unfit to have future citizens, namely people of color, poor people, Jewish people, people with disabilities. So, this logic of extermination is central to colonial discourse and to ableism. Proposing a feminist theory of disability, Rosemary Garland Thompson writes that a vague notion of suffering and its potential deterrence drives much of the logic of elimination that rationalizes selective abortion. A eugenic logic of elimination, which functions to legitimize disability oppression and genocidal practices against disabled people, has likeness to the logic of elimination of settler colonialism. Underlying both settler colonialism and ableism is a logic that is often for indigenous peoples less about exploiting labor and more about eliminating the original inhabitants of land to justify theft for capitalist accumulation, while for disabled people it is about eliminating unfit workers. So trying to enact genocidal policies and to engaged in illegal mining is central to violations of international human rights laws protecting indigenous peoples and their right to land. Similarly, persecuting or refusing to hire people with disabilities is also about securing jobs for able-bodied people, irrespective of human rights laws. The point that the authors make is that violating the law, refusing to recognize international laws regarding Indigenous peoples' titles to land, and refusing to follow affirmative action laws is a way of profiting financially and refusing to compete fairly. So, indigenous epistemology and conceptualizations of relations to land, which reject the reduction of land to a resource or to exchange value, fundamentally contradict the social and spatial relations of capital, thereby undermining capitalism's dominance and supposed naturalness, timelessness, or inevitability. So, if one must follow these laws, then capitalism cannot progress as a system of greed without any reference to human rights and without historical reparations for illegal occupations of land and histories of persecution. Finally, I'll finish by discussing solidarity. Sorry, this is the last point for the lecture. The authors also discuss the importance of solidarity between social movements and solidarity with people with disabilities. So this is a clip regarding the importance of solidarity and being an ally for people with disabilities.
I'm Jess. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a disabled graphic designer that focuses on accessibility and representation and inclusion in design. I'm actually from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. I'm on Instagram, od.jessica, but also importantly, I run with my sister Leanna, The Disabled Life on Instagram, which is something we created to joke about our disabled experiences. So before I begin, I'm just gonna copy, I have an arena channel for like all of the resources from my presentation. So I'm just sending that there so that we have it. And I will begin. So my talk is on the power of solidarity showing up as disabled allies, where I'm going to dive into the ethics behind cross-community activism and recognizing our privileges in marginalized spaces so we can support the Black community in meaningful ways. Going back to basics here with an actual definition. Empathy is the ability to identify with or understand another's situation or feelings. I feel like I'm like back in school doing a presentation, but it is important reminder. Empathy's had a bad reputation, mainly for how it's been used in modern society. That feeling is not an opportunity to try and relate to someone's experience by making it about yourself. You know, we're not saying here, oh my God, I feel you, and then insert big paragraphs about myself. It's simply a way for someone to acknowledge the truths of another human being. We're saying, I can empathize with your pain. I know that feeling of being disregarded. So I'm going to do my best to validate your experiences by being part of the solution for you. So it's time to get back to the basics of empathy, remove our egos so we don't turn the narrative back on ourselves. We should use it as a tool to support each other by holding space for the differences in our lived experiences. There's a history of solidarity and activism. One of my favorite examples is from the film Crip Camp, documenting the disability rights movement which shaped accessibility laws of today. Directed by Nicole Newman and Jim Labrotte, executive produced by President Barack and Michelle Obama. So quick backstory here. Part of the film covers an 11-day sit-in protest back in April 1977 by disabled people for Section 504 inside the Regional Housing Education and Welfare Office in San Francisco. Members of this protest endured through innovation and sheer determination, thanks to Judy Heumann as a major organizer. But part of their endurance was also thanks to major help from the Black Panthers, who came to serve hot meals and support during those 11 days. When protesters look back on that moment, one recalled asking the Black Panthers why they came to help anyway. And their response was simply, you're trying to make the world a better place. And that's what we're all about too. And what a better example of the purest form of empathy in action, right? So we need to come together as marginalized communities to support each other's causes. And in order to do that authentically, it starts with decentering our own injustices when we're supporting someone else's. That's not to say we should erase our own causes. Ableism exists along with racism and other prejudices. But when we use our platforms to compare these experiences, we're really creating a divide that allows the system to continue working against all of us. Which is why it's so important to start by acknowledging our own privileges. I may experience ableism, and sure, that is valid, but it does not waive the large amount of white privilege that I occupy within that space. There are intersections here. Black disabled people experience both racism and ableism, and to dismiss that is harmful. It's hard to move forward without each other. You know, disability activism cannot exist without Black perspectives, and vice versa. And that support starts with expanding our circles. Here are a few accounts that I love and can cram into 5 minutes. Amani Barberin, aka Crutches and Spice, is a communications expert sharing her experiences as a Black woman with CP, or cerebral palsy. Speaking of Black moms we love, Jen White Johnson is a neurodiverse and disabled Afro-Latina artist and designer for Collective Liberation. She's a mother to an autistic son and one of my personal favorite designers who actually created the Black Disabled Lives Matter campaign. There's Jillian Mercado, model, actress, activist, and founder of the Black Disabled Creatives Database. She hits so many notes on representation and created this amazing space for Black disabled creatives to be recognized and hired. Community support too. There are so many avenues of action to participate in allyship. Spread the wealth, support Black-owned businesses. Here's a local one in Hamilton called Black Owned by Abigail, Alexandria, and Ashley Montag, or join mutual aid fund groups online. And I know disabled folk don't always have the funds or can't necessarily safely join in protests right now. So support your local organizers, sign petitions, do what you can from home. We have great organizations like March for Black Lives Canada by Amani Williams. And as freelancers, we can show workspace support. Just because I'm not corporate doesn't mean I can't give within my own practice. Part of the daily routine has been signing on to the Where Are the Black Designers and Design to Divest channels and seeing where I can be of use. When we make one-on-one connections and share our resources, investing in the equity of Black designers becomes a daily practice. Plug into your community channels. Your area of expertise can aid in the growth of others. Like I can offer free accessibility techniques for people, we all have our thing. And marginalized communities support each other. We know how to build a better future. So by sharing our resources and supporting without comparisons, will only lead to a better, more intersectional space. Every action, no matter the scale, has an impact. And that's all she wrote. And by she, I mean me. Resources and research from this is available on that Arena channel. Shout out to Design to Divest for introducing me to that channel because I had no idea what that app was before. A big thank you to Black Designers Ignite for this space and to Amanda Rios and Carly Drew for their guidance and support. If anyone wants to connect ever or talk about accessibility and design, I'm on email od.jessica@gmail.com or Instagram at od.jessica.
That's a clip about solidarity and the importance of solidarity between different subaltern groups. And it's something that the authors of this week's readings talk about in detail when they make reference to Chandra Mohanty, who reminds us solidarity is always an achievement, the result of active struggle. As the disablement of Indigenous peoples' land as a tactic and product of settler colonialism renders clear, there is no disability justice without colonization. The persistence of ableism further undermines the possibility of Indigenous sovereignty, evident in how eugenic ideology normalizes ongoing efforts to eliminate Indigenous peoples and a dearth of public health care that particularly affects Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. So, solidarity can also involve mutual critiques of institutions like the medical system. In conceptualizing the dialectic of oppression and resistance that continuously reshapes the material world, it is also significant that forms of environmental racism that disable Indigenous communities at the same time give way to resistant movements such as Standing Rock. The point is central because it challenges conceptions of disability as solely lack, loss, or social death within the ableist imaginary. Attesting that disability also gives rise to new ways of knowing, thinking, being, and doing that inform struggles towards a more just future. So rather than thinking of lack of those who are people with disabilities and also Indigenous peoples, people in the global South, as those who lack certain traits to resemble Europeans or to resemble people in the first world. Solidarity also is about looking at the ways that knowledge can be produced in new and interesting ways by those who are subaltern or those who are constructed as being non-normative in kind of ideal white settler biopolitics. So I'll finish then with this quote by Eli Clare. Gender reaches into disability. Disability wraps around class. Class strains against abuse. Abuse snarls into sexuality. Sexuality folds on top of race. Everything finally piling into a single human body. To write about any aspect of identity, any aspect of the body, means writing about this entire maze. So this kind of knowledge production challenges the ways in which colonial knowledge production has often begun from this place of empty positivism, a universalist subject who is in a position to judge and order, to ridicule, to condemn otherness outside of this very specific and very kind of minute position of privilege in comparison to the rest of the world and in comparison to all other bodies. And so one of the central kind of tensions in decolonial theory and in theories of disability and identity is to unmark this kind of position of a privileged normative body and its capital and where its financial capital comes from and where the sense of authority of this kind of archetypal white settler gaze comes from and how this very privileged position of an omnipotent unmarked narrator is actually imbued with the weight of colonial history, and really is a criminal gaze. So I hope that is useful, and I hope that you're enjoying the class. And I think as we go on, I'll discuss the law in more detail. And it's important to think about the ways that discrimination is not a choice, that discrimination often involves, I mean, we have the right to have discriminating taste or personal choices, but institutional discrimination involves violations of the law. And one of the ways that we can think about Indigenous studies and anti-colonial scholarship and theories of disability are uh, di- disability studies, sorry, is to think about the law and the ways that our institutions and our employment practices, hiring practices, and our everyday interaction with others should involve a celebration of and respect for human rights laws. So that's all. I hope that you are enjoying the class. Thank you.